Good evening, good afternoon. I'm Casey, and I'm here with Hannah. And we are the Non-Existent Story, a storytelling, story listening, story reading podcast in which one of us, this week Hannah, will tell us two stories, one real, one of them fake. And we will decide which is the real one and which is the one that Hannah made up. I am in Madrid. It is 8 a.m. Hannah's in Phoenix. It's 11 p.m. So that adds an extra. We are also outside space and time. So Hannah, what do you have for us this week?
This week's two stories are inspired by your last episode, Casey, where you focused on spiritists and spiritism. So taking that from you, I'm taking it into the realm of mysticism. Specifically origins in Greek mythology, and more specifically in how it can and has been applied to the genre of the horror story. So I hope you will be entertained, yes. And
I'm going to take notes.
And take copious notes. Summary one. Summary one. Two men pace the terrace of a secluded countryside estate. The pale one is Dr. Raymond, devoted these last 20 years to the study of transcendental medicine. The anxious one is Mr. Clark. Clark is a respected man of business whose secret life's work is compiling memoirs to prove the existence of the devil. He has come to observe Dr. Raymond operate on a trusting and beautiful young woman named Mary. The doctor hypothesizes that a microscopical alteration to her gray matter will alter her consciousness and reveal to her the hidden world. Unfortunately, the surgery lobotomizes her. Dr. Raymond explains to the horrified Clark that these results are to be expected from contact with the old gods. Haunted by the incident, Clark returns to London, determined to leave the mystic world behind. Some years pass, and Clark, still pining for the unseen, returns to his old obsession. His only friend, Mr. Villiers, knows nothing of Clark's unnatural preoccupations. He does not know that Clark's sole pleasure is reading, compiling, and rearranging his dark memoirs, that engaged in this pursuit, the evenings seem to fly and the nights appear too short. One evening, Clark, adding sinister stories to his collection, comes across the tale of a certain Helen Vaughan. Helen, an orphaned child, is sent to a small village in Rome by a mysterious benefactor to be raised by peasant farmers. Helen's new home sits where once had stood the temple of the god of the deeps. Helen delights in wandering the ancient woods unattended, and she grows beautiful and terrifying to look upon. She is implicated in the death of one child and the insanity of another. Helen vanishes into the sunlight of a meadow. This story fills Clark with cold foreboding, and on the heels of it, London is hit by a rash of suicides. In 5 weeks, 5 young men of wealth and prominence are found hanged and decaying in their fashionable gardens and bedrooms. Fortunately, Mr. Villiers, who prides himself as a practiced explorer of obscure mazes and byways of London life, and displaying an assiduity worthy of more serious employment, Mr. Clark, that the 5 deceased had consorted with the same mysterious woman. Mr. Villiers presents Clark with a sketch of her. Clark recognizes Mary's features, though they are twisted in the most vivid presentment of evil he has ever seen. Clark and Villiers learn that she is Helen Vaughan, though her real name is Helen Raymond. They confront Helen and persuade her to hang herself. In her death throes, they call in a medical doctor who watches in horror as Helen's body transforms and dissolves. After Helen's death, Clark writes Dr. Raymond, describing what has transpired. Dr. Raymond finds the news unsurprising, for it was he who had sent Helen to Rome at age 5, when her pagan nature had begun to assert itself. Mary was dead, had died immediately after Helen's birth. And Helen was born 9 months after Mary's surgery, 9 months to the day of the ill-fated experiment, which had exposed Mary to the old gods, and the old gods to Mary. End of summary 1. I will now do my dramatic reading. Accompanied by Christoph Penderecki's polymorphia, which you will recognize if you have seen The Exorcist. It's really groovy.
So much scarier in the dark here.
I know.
Horror stories are scary at 8.
So here we go. Can you hear it?
Yes. Is it supposed to sound like a bunch of people screaming?
Though horror and revolting nausea rose up within me, and an odor of corruption choked my breath, I remained firm. I was then privileged or cursed, I dare not say which, to see that which was on the bed, lying there black like ink, transformed before my eyes as I turned on the volume on my phone a little bit. The skin and the flesh and the muscles and the bones and the firm structure of the human body that I had thought to be unchangeable and permanent as adamant began to melt and dissolve. I know that the body may be separated into its elements by external agencies, but I should have refused to believe what I saw, for here there was some internal force, of which I knew nothing, that caused dissolution and change. Here too was all the work by which man had been made, repeated before my eyes. I saw the form waver from sex to sex, dividing itself from itself, and then again reunited. Then I saw the body descend to the beasts whence it ascended, and that which was on the heights go down to the depths, even to the abyss of all being. The principle of life, which makes organism, always remained, while the outward form changed. The light within the room had turned to blackness, not the darkness of night, in which objects are seen dimly, clearly and without difficulty, but it was the negation of light. Objects were presented to my eyes, if I may say so, without any medium, in such a manner that if there had been a prism in the room, I should have seen no colors represented in it. I watched, and at last I saw nothing but a substance as jelly. Then the ladder was ascended again. I saw a form, shaped in dimness before me, which I will not farther describe, but the symbol of this form may be seen in ancient sculptures and in paintings which survived beneath the lava, too foul to be spoken of. As a horrible and unspeakable shape, neither man nor beast, was changed into human form, there came finally death. Ooh.
Chilling. Dude. This is very interesting. Wait, was that from Dr. Raymond's perspective?
No, that was from the perspective of the medical doctor that was called into the room as the men had convinced Helen to hang herself, and she was in her death throes. So as she was dying, they had the doctor rush in, and that is what the doctor...
And this is what the doctor says. Okay, but it's not the same doctor. It's a different doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. All right. Summary 2. If you're ready. Are you ready? Are you ready? Summary 2.
In your book.
For 3 days, rumors circulate amongst the cattle ranchers. More men are found each morning in the frost, gored and gnawed upon. In daylight hours, the ranchers blame Nelson Story's longhorns, brought by train from Texas to western Montana. It takes little imagination to picture the damage those massive horns could do to a man caught unaware. But in the dark hours, they blame the white bull. For a moment, we are transported to an ancient time when a god cursed a queen to fall in love with a white bull. Leontis has been a ranch hand in Deer Lodge Valley, Montana, for as long as he can remember. Finishing his daily rounds, he comes upon a half-naked man with a sword, suspiciously prodding a frozen corpse. Leontis instinctively draws his pistol. The man addresses him in an unknown tongue. Through some creative sign language, the two agree this is the work of a mad bull. In accord, the stranger gestures for Leontis to follow him towards the mountains. The snow begins to fall in earnest. Leontis, on horseback, trudges behind the stranger, who seems impervious to the cold. Through flurries, Leontis sees familiar shapes pacing beside them. They are the longhorn bulls, though their signature red patches are so faded in the snow, the beasts appear eerily white. The bulls unexpectedly charge them. The stranger leaps onto Leontis's horse, and the men gallop deeper into the valley. Soon a horrifying silhouette confronts them, ancient and horned. It bellows, and the mountains crack ominously. The panicked horse shakes its riders and disappears into the oncoming avalanche. Stuck in the snow, Leontis watches dazed as the stranger and the monster battle. The stranger is fatally wounded, and Leontis fires on the Minotaur as the avalanche overwhelms them. Time recedes, and Leontis opens his eyes to a terrible noise. All around him is blackness and dripping stone. The Minotaur, bloody and clearly dying, has devoured the stranger whole. It roars at Leontis and collapses. Carved figures on the walls of the labyrinth seem to glow and twist. There is a sculpture of a great snake with 3 heads, the first of a man, the second a lion, the third a bull. The bull's stone eyes glower. The snake intertwines a beautiful woman holding a spindle. A voice whispers, and necessitas. From the spindle, a cool mist envelops Leontis. When it vaporizes, he is identical in form and feature to the stranger, Prince Theseus of Athens. The carvings still and darken. Slowly, the new prince bends to clasp a familiar strand of twine. He passes the dead Minotaur as he follows the twine from the heart of the maze. And that is the second summary. And my dramatic reading will be accompanied by different groovy
Country
music. Yes. Specifically, because what could be more horrifying? Although, to be fair, it's from the soundtrack of I think it's called Once Upon a Western. It's supposed to be one of the greatest films of all time.
Once Upon a Time in the Wild West?
Something like that. By Ennio Morricone's
Morricone.
Man with a Harmonica.
Excellent choice. I love him.
He's very good. I'm only recently introduced, but anyway, I digress.
He doesn't make a good Pandora channel, though. You only hear the good, the bad, and the ugly, like, over and over again. It's very odd.
How haunting and yet miserable.
I mean, it's really exciting for a while.
Yes. Hold on. I gotta time
This
this
is
right.
classic. I love the song. It's super chilly. Okay.
I know, I love it. Okay.
I've already been conditioned to be in the mood for this one.
Ready.
Especially. Yes.
Okay. She had despaired bitterly, most bitterly. But this construct was her salvation. She marveled at it. Like all of Daedalus's inventions, it was simple, but its genius was in its simplicity. Shaped as a she-cow and covered in stitched hide, with just the space inside she would require. Positioned at last within the structure, palace guards carried her to his pastures. At last, he would have her. ... Leontis cocked his pistol, but he did not know what to make of the man, and could not rightly fire on him without first considering his predicament in each aspect. He was stocky and dark-skinned, similar to the Indians of the Salish tribe. But his clothes were like nothing they wore. His clothes, Leontis shook his head. They were not enough to keep a man alive long in western Montana. Still stranger was his sword. It was not the saber of a cavalryman. It was broader and heavier, shorter than a pickaxe and wickedly sharp. And it was pointed at him. Considerations. English? Leontis asked. The man, who appeared just as taken aback by the looks of Leontis, shook his head impatiently. Eyes steady upon him, he stabbed his sword towards the corpse and spoke in a strange tongue. Unintelligible, not seems Salish. You do that? The ranch hand asked, pointing at the body with his chin. He looked more closely and grimaced. Pockets of flesh gaped in the corpse's chest, just as it had been with the others. Both men turned quickly to the sound of heavy hooves. The head of a white bull crested slowly over the hill, curved horns spanning 5 feet. Hot steam shot from its nostrils as it breathed, and in a moment both Leontis's gun and the stranger's sword were trained on the animal. The bull, ignorant to danger, plodded past them without interest. Observing the red patches in the longhorn's thick coat, they released identical cries of tension and then glanced at each other, assessing. Leontis looked once more to the dead man on the ground. Whatever dark implement that had killed him, it had not been the work of a sword. The stranger spoke again, more harshly, sheathed his sword, and curled his fingers to his head in the shape of horns. He pointed to the corpse more gently, paused, then withdrew his sword and stabbed viciously towards the mountains.
That was great.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, this is a really interesting hybrid genre that I think works actually quite well, and I don't know why. Before I make more general observations of things that I like, which are unusual religious systems that are also medical systems, and mythology and westerns, all things that I like. I'll try summarizing it, and you can comment as needed. Okay, yes. So in our first story, we begin with 2 figures, and this story actually has various levels of reality that we enter into and then exit out of. And because it's a summary, obviously we have to do so rather quickly. But we have Dr. Raymond, who's a transcendental scientist or transcendental doctor or transcendental physician. Mm-hmm. But basically kind of believes in certain direct causalities between different parts of the brain and a connection with higher or lower, probably, but higher states of being. So there's some sort of bridge, scientific bridge that he's trying to cross, much like Spiritism, which I thought was interesting. And then you have Mr. Clark, who's a businessman. But it is the businessman that you would expect to be kind of like a pragmatic materialist, perhaps, or something like that. But in fact, he is more directly in touch with far more medieval or even ancient modes of marginal knowledge, if you want to call them. So he collects memoirs that try to prove the existence of the devil, which I think is a great thing to collect, and I want to collect them too.
It wouldn't be hard, I don't think.
I think we should make an anthology. Mm-hmm. Especially because even then with the language of proof is also something that I associate with like this 19th century attempt to unite various forms of religion with with science, or in this case, business, in some sort of indirect way that would be cool to know it. It wasn't the fuller version. And then Mr. Clark is the observer of a woman who Dr. Raymond operates on, and then ends up lobotomizing her instead of extracting what he meant to extract. And then I have to hear old gods in parentheses. I don't remember why. I don't remember who invoked the old gods in that context. Was it Mr. Raymond or was it Dr. Raymond or Mr. Clark?
Well, it was Dr. Raymond, and the intent was that Mary would be able, after this operation, to perceive this hidden world. And
okay.
The doctor was saying that the lobotomy was a result of her interaction with the old gods.
Okay, interesting. And again, like I think it's also very indicative and realistic of the 19th century, of like women as this kind of object that was both privileged but then acted upon by like the men who as bearers of knowledge. So they would be mediums and oracles and things like that, but then they could also end up under the knife, as it were. And then there's so at that point, kind of Dr. Raymond and Mr. Clark part paths, and we stick with Mr. Clark for a while, and who meets a certain Villiers, and kind of gives himself over to the collection of these stories that try to prove the devil, which I love. And he comes across a story of certain Helen Vaughan, and this Helen Vaughan is actually contemporary, right, with him?
Yes, it's yes.
So he comes across the story in like a newspaper.
Well, a friend tells him about it. He disdains he disdains the written. He disdains print. So his collections are actually, I don't really get into it, but they're all handwritten. And he'll go over them, and he's compulsive. He reads and rereads and rearranges, and he writes down stories he hears about and people tell him. And so he's written down this story that a friend has related about Helen Vaughan.
Okay. So yeah, all right. So they're kind of testimonies or something. Yeah, I kind of pictured him for a moment as like later becoming one of those crazy men in like a public library or a university library or the bus station, or a number of things. The very, very inspired writings, by dense inspired writings. All right, so then that happens. So he comes across the story. So you have this very brief frame tale. And there's a certain mirroring, perhaps, that becomes more apparent later. And then there's a rash of upper class suicides, which I guess is the only kind of rash of suicides one would have, probably in the 19th century, especially because the lower class suicides are maybe not reported on. But these are quite theatrical and ghastly. And I don't remember exactly the connection between the suicides, but he finds out that Helen Vaughan is actually Helen Raymond, and that the suicides make they set up like a foil. So he finds out that Helen Vaughan is actually Helen Raymond. So already we have this marrying between Dr. Raymond and the last name of this girl. So we start to see like these mirrorings or these connections or these doubles, and then together with Villiers or with someone else.
Mm-hmm. With Villiers. Villiers is the one that actually makes the connection, and then explains the connection to Clark.
Right. Okay. All right. So he explains the connection. So there's always like this. It's interesting. There's always this mediated knowledge, right? So people get really into it and really grasp, but it's never firsthand. It's always a little bit beyond. And then they, I guess they come up with this very ingenious device of murder, which is rather Hercule Poirot-esque. I think I'm thinking of Curtin, I guess specifically, and they persuade her to kill herself, which would also have been a very interesting dialogue to hear. But I'm sure she's quite mad, so that might be a little bit easier. And that way she just kind of fits into this rash of suicides, and their hands, so to speak, are clean. And then it turns out that she's kind of a double of Mary. So as soon as Mary, the woman who was perhaps had powers, was put under the knife. She's more or less like reincarnated almost as Helen, which the Dr. Raymond in his ever disastrous attempts to encourage contact with his with his elevated beings, his interbrooding lives all over the place. But he sends them, but at the same time, he must be onto something. Or but perhaps it's Mr. Clark who's onto something. So it's really interesting. We don't have a sense of like who's right or wrong ever. But it seems that whenever Dr. Raymond gets involved in some way, it's actually a much older magic or older system of beliefs that actually is still influential. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of, well, I mean, I see this very Victorian, I guess, because I'm still like with the spiritist thing and it has these kinds of issues, but also because, what was I going to say? Oh, it reminded me actually of not only a Victorian, but like there's a BBC series that's based on a novel called Fry. No, it's not Fry. It's not that one. It's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Have you heard of it?
I don't know. Maybe
it's interesting because it also, but in the 18th century, which is like the quote unquote age of enlightenment, there's a kind of a resurgence of magic in England of all places, and then they use it in wars with Napoleon and things like that. So there's this like weird intersections of knowledge. But anyway, there's this kind of enlightened magic that's not really explained, at least in the series, but it has to do with books and access to books, and you don't really need a talent, you just need a vast and expansive library, which in the 18th century is quite hard. And then there's this other guy who has a more natural talent, and he seems to have tapped into something that's much more dangerous and kind of has to do with fairies and this much older magic. So it kind of reminded me a little bit of that, but again, like neither of these men have like any privileged access to truth. And then the excerpt is great. So I really like the excerpt because there's this. It lends itself very well to like a painting or something, because it's all about it projects in visual form the monstrosity and the horror of certain kinds of hybridities, if that makes sense. So like you have this one thing that keeps transforming constantly into something else, and one of the things that produces horror, and it has produced horror in many ways, either as horror stories or just as like social rejection, is like something that we can't categorize. So is it male or is it female, for example, or is it a man or is it a fish, or does this happen to you? Happens to me all the time. And it's constantly morphing, but there's this sense of kind of palpitating life beneath it all. And here in Madrid, there's a special exhibition right now of the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch. Have you seen anything by him?
Mm-mm.
Dude, I will send you a link. You will enjoy. But he's from the end of the 16th century. Like 16th century. So 500 years ago. It's the 500th anniversary of his death. But he did nothing like anything else. You would illustrate like these elaborate scenes of heaven and hell, or various scenes from like the life of saints, and foregrounded there'd be like a little saint or something very conventional. But then there's these impossible monsters that like the surrealists would later find like really interesting, where it's like a fish that's also a woman, that's also a tree, and it has a lantern and it's flying, and he uses them particularly in the case of hell. So the hellish being is
those are always more fun, I find.
Yes, well, he does some interesting stuff with the earth, because at least in 500 years ago, apparently life was much like hell, or more like hell than heaven. So you'll still find in kind of like the world of men, you'll find certain hybrid beings that symbolize corruption and things like that. And the moralism, I think you can kind of dispense with because of the fantastical nature. But again, the hybridity and the morphing or whatever is always a sign of like corruption and horror and the devil and his contact and the devil, in fact, with the hooves and the man horns and all this kind of thing. It's like so anyway, I really enjoyed that image, and especially the negation of light but not darkness, because again it made me think like with Bosch you'll have like these black backgrounds and then certain figures will jump out in this kind of a chiaroscuro that I don't know how to pronounce, like this dramatic visual interplay of light and darkness. So I think that if that is not illustrated yet, it should be by you, especially. But you should see Bosch first. I'll send you some links or something.
Yes, please do. I'm very intrigued.
But yeah, so I did have a question. All right, so that was my long summary, which may have just summarized your summary. I'm sorry if that was so detailed. But I guess, all right, so the memoirs of the devil, are we thinking, or maybe it's clear in the original and maybe it's ambiguous, but like, is this a kind of pagan diabolicalness, or is this a kind of offshoot, like a medieval Dark Ages offshoot of a Christian notion of the devil? Like, what kind of devil is this? Or are they devils?
Well, keeping in the realms of mysticism, it's again more influenced by the ancient world. I think it has lent itself to medieval Christianity, but I think in its purest form, it's more of, I associate it more with like the Greeks and the Romans. So there's more of the sense of the ancient gods and understanding of the world at play, perhaps, than something that's more like demonic and medieval. Although you see strains of that in mysticism as well, but its original founding, I think of it as more of a Greek thing. As far as the devil plays a role in it, however, the devil is more of a medieval kind of creation and focus. So I think you could play with it both ways.
Interesting. I mean, always. I read somewhere, and I do think it's in some ways true that the devil is one of the most interesting literary characters ever invented, and endlessly fascinating. And but actually, before I summarize the second one, would you kind of give a brief summary for our listeners? Because of course I know all about it. Of mysticism and its major tenets and its origins, and then we'll go into the next one.
Right. Well, I'm not an expert about it, but as I said, I was inspired by your last episode, which was about spiritists and spiritism, which is a bit of an offshoot, I think, from mysticism. There's similarities between the two. It is concerned with an invisible kind of spiritual world, but they approach it from different ways. And I think mysticism is perhaps less concerned with the scientific approach to understanding spirits, as more as it is concerned with universal truths and it's just perhaps the easiest way for me to explain it is if you tie it in with Greek mythology. And so you have all of these celestial beings, these gods and goddesses and greater powers. And it can be metaphoric, but the existence of those powers is not necessarily metaphoric. You can interpret it both ways, and still it's still within mysticism.
Okay.
I don't think I can explain this quite as succinctly, perhaps, but
no. I'm sure. But because my only like contact with mystic is like in college, at least, we read certain mystic poets, and it's a lot about, it's much pure. There's not really so much um, of a sense of dark forces, and it was more about usually the phrase I've seen is like mystical union. So that's when you kind of like, it's interesting actually, because yeah, it has to do with the dissolution of individuality, which then is united in this great oneness.
You can think of it kind of like a nirvana sort of thing. It's to achieve. I've read achieve ecstasy.
Yes.
Spiritual is kind of vague, but the achievement of ecstasy and a higher understanding, which is spiritual but not
right
necessarily. Yes.
Yeah, no, this is, it's a big thing in Dostoevsky. There's always like I think the idiot is kind of a mystic too, and Russians always have some concept of the devil. So I just think it's interesting because like when I usually think of it as a kind of a neutral or positive, albeit vague tendency, and to think about its dark side is actually quite fascinating. So, all right, well, we'll go to the second one, and then I'll ask more questions about comparisons. All right, so the second one is a Western, which I really like, and any Sergio Leone music soundtracks are always welcome for me. So it starts out with a sense of rumor and amongst the cattle ranchers, and we're kind of in the winter in Western Montana. So there's this this quite in the Wild West, as it were. So we already know that, I mean, it's kind of like an empty white background against which all this is playing out, as opposed to the first one, which I felt was more dense and perhaps even a little Victorian, you know. But this one is quite desolate and white. And for some reason, I imagined the first one to be British. Am I right or no?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we have kind of a British American interplay, which you've kind of dabbled with before. I really like those. So men have been found gored, and they suspect the white bull. And there's a reference to a god who cursed a queen to fall in love with a bull, and then in a very elegant way, you bring in only later, after we've kind of established the rules of this world, an allusion to the Minotaur. Which I associate with this story about the labyrinth and Daedalus I think it's Daedalus, who tries to escape from the labyrinth and the Minotaur. But I don't know that myth super well. So I don't know, I heard like a knocking sound, but it could have just been the breeze. And we have, wait, 1 second. Is someone knocking? Oh, okay. All right, someone's knocking, but Cody will
take care
of it. Yes, it could be a ghost. It could also be a roommate.
Could be the white bull.
It could. Ooh. Yeah. So we have Leontis, who's a farmhand, and he's kind of. And so this is the background in which he's like kind of wanting about, and he sees this half-naked man with a sword, which is already quite striking. 1 second. Is everything okay? Okay. He sees a half-naked man with a sword, which is interesting because I didn't expect to see, a sword already seems out of place and somehow like mythic or grandiose or epic or something, because again, like I associate either like maybe short knives or like guns with the Wild West. So this already quite the image. I didn't take as many notes for this one for some reason. I think I got like captivated or something more, or I don't know, I think I got lazy probably is the actual answer to that. So then basically he's riding along and he sees this figure, and then before these figures can enter into any sort of combative relationship, there's like a bull that enters on the horizon, and then the man jumps atop Leontis' horse, and they ride off together. And he doesn't speak English, but they have kind of a conversation, and then there's this great reading about their encounter, which again I didn't write as many notes for, but which I thought was really cool. I feel like I went too long with my first summary, so I'm trying to be more succinct here. My first summary of your summary, but Yeah, so can you I guess can you flesh out a little bit how you see this story interacting with the myth of the Minotaur, and if this half-naked man is kind of like a Western reincarnation or reflection or double. Doubles are always big, I guess, in horror, but like double of whatchamacallit, of the Daedalus Minotaur myth or something. And also the one about the woman who falls in love with the bull, because I don't remember that one.
Okay, so the myth of the Minotaur, which I had to look up, is actually I found the history of the Minotaur to be incredibly intriguing and dark and fascinating. So there's a bit of backstory on the Greek mythology. I'll try to stay succinct. There's a king competing with his brother to become king of Crete. And he asks for the support of a god, I believe, like Poseidon. And Poseidon gives his support. And he shows that he's giving his support by giving the king a white bull. And he does this, and then the guy becomes king. And the agreement was he would slaughter the bull and sacrifice to Poseidon once he became king. But he decides not to do this because he thinks the white bull is really cool and groovy. And so he kills other bulls instead. But this doesn't fly with Poseidon. And so to curse the king, to punish the king, he curses the queen to fall in love with the bull. She does, and she has Daedalus. Yes, he constructs a wooden bowl for the queen that she gets inside of, and then the guards push it into the bull's pasture, and they do the nasty, and then the Minotaur is born 9 months later. And the Minotaur, initially, I guess the queen breastfeeds him and everything's normal until he gets a little bit older, at which point he is inconsolable and evil and ferocious because he cannot be nourished by regular food, only by the flesh of other human beings. So the king and the queen have Daedalus construct the labyrinth or the maze, in the center of which they place the Minotaur. And every year or every 9 years, it fluctuates, they sacrifice 7 men and 7 women to be fed to the Minotaur. So that's the backstory. And then there's the defeat of the Minotaur, which is also very important, and I think to this particular story, which is Prince Theseus of Athens, versus Prince Theseus. So Theseus, whom Leontis ends up morphing into in the end of this story, their identities are kind of morphed together. He, in the original tale, sacrifice, and the king and the princess falls in love with him and gives him a ball of twine. And when he's thrown into the maze, he ties the twine to the beginning of the maze, wanders into the heart of the maze, he battles the Minotaur and kills him, and then he has this ball of twine at his disposal. So that's
twine is cool.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's cool. I'm glad you read some of that. It's a really good one. Well, it's funny because it's like in Latin America, the labyrinth motif is really big, and there's a couple stories by Borges, or at least one, in which the Minotaur myth is kind of referenced, but from I don't want to give it away. Well, but I will give it away. But basically, it's like told from the perspective of the Minotaur, and you don't really realize that till the end. So it's kind of cool. But I forgot the whole myth, which is really quite. Again, like it's interesting because I think I don't know if it's this fusion of of dark mysticism and Greek mythology, which has to do the horror or the rejection, even pre-Christian, and pre-Bosch, also the painter, is this like hybrid being, and so you have like these unholy unions, as it were, that produce these kind of monstrous creatures. Although I guess it's not really the Minotaur's fault so much. So is the man who's found half naked and apparently somewhat immortal, or perhaps already dead, or his state is super ambiguous, which I think is really interesting. Because ghosts don't usually, well, I guess some ghosts have swords, never mind. But is he Daedalus-ish?
No, he is Theseus.
He's Theseus, okay.
Yes. He's Theseus,
Okay.
pursuing the bull to kill him. And then when he is killed, in the end, Leontis is transformed into Theseus.
Okay. I got you. So yeah, again, like this sense of like reincarnation of a figure, but in this case, a much more specific figure who is imposed with or given the traits of the predecessor. So you actually, all right. So instead of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth, which is like the more famous one, you kind of opted here, at least, or whoever wrote the story, for the pre-story, which I think is really cool because I didn't remember, and quite disturbing and juicy too at the same time, especially the building of the contraption to I kind of vision like something like it has wheels and they just kind of like push her down, you know,
It is squeaking.
Also a great image to paint. I don't know if that one's been as inspiring of a myth for hundreds and hundreds of years of painters. Spent a lot of time in museums lately, so like a more visual sense, and especially with like these divine forms kind of floating out, and they're all Rubicons and yes, things like that. All right, so yeah, why do you think? I don't think I asked you this, but why do you think that mysticism and Greek mythology do kind of work together? Like what makes them compatible? Because I wouldn't normally think of them
Um,
as comparable traditions or blendable or traditions.
I have no idea because mysticism, as I understand it, does seem like a mostly positive kind of all-encompassing genre or belief, whereas Greek mythology is anything but that, as we are finding.
Exactly.
So I
No,
don't
no, it's super
know.
adaptable. Yeah.
I guess the only thing I could think of would have to be they had the oracles. Even the ancient Greeks had oracles, and oracles had this. I mean, they were to specific gods and goddesses. They'd be the oracle of X or Y or Z, but that sense of spiritual embodiment and channeling to some higher power and kind of connection with the world in that way is a profound image when you read about it in the old texts, and I can see how that would still carry through. So perhaps that is the link, but outside of that, I have no idea.
Well, no, it's just interesting to me. I don't really either, but I think that at least in like the spiritist kind of stuff, they're like, well, spiritualism has always existed, and then they kind of make a very strong connection, or they try to make a strong connection between the modern medium and the oracles. So that's a lot of what, and so yeah, again, like usually there's this sense of like limited, limited sight is very popular. So like the story that I read last week, not to make this all about me, the story of it this week, she was kind of she wasn't a medium, but she was like almost blind and suffered from blindness, and I think that was like some sort of affinity. But yeah, anyway, they whenever they make little historic arguments, they refer to the Greeks. So, and then yeah, the kind of another interesting thing between the two is like the kind of the minor and yet extremely pivotal in terms of story role that the woman plays. So in the first one, there's like a doubling, like a reincarnation, and a kind of a sense of almost well, it's not really vengeance. She kind of gets killed twice, but at the same time, like this again, this masculine knowledge trying to be. Well, I guess this is leading to me to make my guess. Okay, as to which one you wrote.
Mm.
Are we ready for that?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
You can get that.
Okay, may I? Yes. Okay, cool. All right, so you usually have, and you're much better about this than I am, I think, of incorporating very strong female characters or female authors or things like that, because one does realize how much of a masculine world literature has been for a very long time, and not by necessity. And so this one has like more, both of them have more minor roles with like more male protagonists. But if I had to guess, and I do, which one you wrote, I would say that you wrote the first one because it reverberates or echoes a little bit one of the themes that you did a few weeks ago, which is this kind of like interplay between like male expertise and then a sort of a women's world which is inaccessible. And here they're solitary figures and they're very much in the background. They don't really speak, at least in the summer, but then no one speaks in summers. Yeah, so basically the kind of male expertise, which is proved to be flawed, and its female world, which seems like that kind of seems like it's something that you're into. That, and then there was, I actually thought it was, yeah, I don't know that. So I'm gonna say that you were the first one, and one, because I'd be surprised if you choose a Western, although you have surprised me before. Guessing that you wrote the first one, and maybe like Lovecraft or something wrote the second one.
Wow. Well, I'm very flattered, but I actually did write the second one.
Really?
And yes,
Damn it, I'm so behind now.
No, but Arthur Machen wrote the first one, which is funny that you should say, because Arthur Machen was one of the key influences for Lovecraft. And he wrote it, and I had to be very careful to avoid mentioning the title within the book. He wrote, it's called The Great God Pan.
Okay.
And he wrote it in 1890, and then it was republished in 1894. But
okay.
Stephen King has cited The Great God Pan as the greatest horror novel ever written in the English language, I have learned.
Really?
Yes. So it's had a really pretty significant influence on Stephen King, Lovecraft. There are a couple other guys I think I wrote down. Clark Ashton Smith and Peter Straub, if you've heard of them. I don't know a lot about the horror genre, really. I wish I knew more.
I think you know more than I do about it. I know Lovecraft, but just because he more like sci-fi type stuff.
Yeah. So he was a big influence on Lovecraft, but Arthur Machen was a mysticist, or he believed in mysticism, although somehow he was still able to be a member of the Anglican Church and believed in that too. But he was Welsh. And very critical of Spiritism, according to Wikipedia. I don't know why. Yeah, it was just strange. I don't know. I must learn more, I suppose, about both subjects, because the two seem very similar to me. But apparently, they're different enough for them to be at war with each other in some senses, or at least that is how Arthur Machen felt. But yes, The Great God Pan, 1980. Wow, yes, yeah, 1890.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I mean, the tricky thing with these, I suppose, is that one also, right, preferences can be expressed either in reading preferences or in writing preferences. So, God damn it. Yes. Down by 2. We have to have some sort of like consequence at some point for these.
I suppose.
But yeah, like a lot of them, like the last one I got wrong. If I thought later, I was like, if I thought about that a little more, I think I would have guessed opposite, but this one, no. I think if I thought about it more, I still guessed what I guessed. So,
No, I was surprised
because, twice. Shame on me.
Because I actually really had a lot of fun writing this one. This might have been my favorite so far because
it's very good. It's very well. It's Tarantino-ish. So.
Well, no, Tarantino. Well, Tarantino was influenced by the Western, whose music I kind of stole. I learned so much when I read.
Yes, that and I was thinking about the Hateful Eight too, the more recent one, which has kind of got this Western blizzard thing. Which I haven't seen as many Westerns with snow. Usually it's just kind of dry because they're in Mexico or Texas or something. But I really like it because it lends to not only like dramatic action because there's so few characters and so everything takes on this epic form and significance, but also just like this different kind of horror because I think it was Edgar Allan Poe who decided that white was and not black is the color of horror.
Oh, I completely agree. I find white terrifying. Imagine walking into a white house where you can't get anything dirty. What kind of person would live in such a place? It's terrifying.
Freakish hybrid bull reincarnation people.
Mm-hmm. So I actually was thinking about that too. No, white is scary. But yeah, Deer Lodge, Montana is the valley, is a real valley in western Montana. And Nelson's Story had longhorns imported there in 1866. So that was kind of my goal, make it like an 1860s kind of thing. But I liked it because I got to play, I was actually playing with time travel, which to me has always been really fascinating, kind of cool. So imagine if this ancient Greek heroic figure is walking up on this ancient Greek monster, and just as he's about to stab him, the monster disappears into 1866 Montana, surrounded by herds of bulls, and then kills people. And then days later, the hero is also moved there because everything must reorient itself. And he finds a corpse in the snow and he's poking at it. And then this strange cowboy comes up on him and they try to like figure out what the hell's going on and then chase after this minotaur who's running rampant in Montana. To me, just seemed really, really fun. So I enjoyed that.
That was fantastic. And the time traveling animal being the key is quite cool. And again, like it was quite, I think just kind of the allusions to the myth that were placed but not like belabored was really nice because then you get a sense of like haunting resonance, but it's not like over explained, so it doesn't beat you over the head with it.
Yeah, well, I rewrote it. I like that. Yes, well, I had to rewrite it. I originally had a whole paragraph where it shoots back in time to the queen and things that she's doing, and she's notified of the treachery, and she creates a spell to help save her son. And I thought it was a bit too much, although I wanted to keep it because I had another reference where apparently this queen, after she gives birth to this minotaur, according to the myth, creates a fidelity charm that she puts on her husband so that whenever he ejaculates, it is serpents and scorpions and centipedes, thereby killing any unlawful concubine that he may try to sleep with.
That would be a terrible way to die.
Oh my God. So I really wanted that detail. So I didn't want to delete the whole paragraph because of that one detail, but I ended up thinking it would have.
Sexual punishments are probably the worst. Like, I mean, the whole bull thing was humiliating enough, but one presumes at least that she enjoyed it. The serpents and snakes, the what is the word that I want? But yes, the injection of tiny. I guess they would have to be quite small.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
but maybe they would expand once they come out.
Seemed appropriate for a horror film. The Greeks did.
They come up with some crazy stuff. I mean, there's like the Zeus and the Swan. I remember that one, but and then like so-and-so turns into a tree. Actually, there's a lot of like a little bit hybrid things, but I feel like that's not as horrifying in the Greek mythology as it becomes in Christian of anything that's not pure, because Christianity is the one that's like obsessed with purity and all this shit, but or stuff. this for. But wow, dude.
I'm telling you, I like why we never learned any of this stuff as kids when we were learning about the Greeks. I feel like we would have found it a far more interesting topic if we had.
I know, right? Like usually you just have to tell something like absolutely horrifying, especially to a high schooler, and they'll be into it. Yeah, no, the Greeks you kind of get. Yeah, I could get a lot. I kind of missed out on that a lot. But yeah, Hermes and a little bit of like Zeus and Hera is quite jealous, but yes, like jealousies and infidelities have always been very productive in terms of creativity. It's a great motif.
Yeah, so if I were to ever try to develop this story, I would find a way of incorporating that arm into it somehow. So someone gets cursed with evil insect ejaculate, but I don't know.
Yeah, but then just this kind of a, yeah. No, I would use that. Well, it sounds like kind of almost like a, yeah, it's very witchy. Like a Macbeth kind of, but witches, I don't know if they do much sexual stuff. I don't know. Yeah, no, well, so tell me, all right, so the first one is the great god Pan, and then what's the second one called?
I think I would call it the White Bull.
The White Bull. Okay, yeah, I like that. Yeah, and again, yeah, because you have this like, well, the myth and then the pre-myth, because the Daedalus one is super complicated because then he escapes with Icarus, I think.
Yeah,
so and then I think that's
thing.
the one with the sun. So he has actually like, it's a like very long story trajectory.
There's a whole arch.
I'm sure it'd be a good novel, the Daedalus novel, because again, like it's too many stories even to capture with them. Because usually myths are like, they're cool because they're very simplified stories. Like usually you can summarize them quite quickly. But this one is because Daedalus's arc is like really involved.
Well, Jim Henson very impressively had a brief series. I think he ran it out of England because the US, of course, would never have supported it. But he had a series that was Greek mythologies with Muppets and puppets. And also live actors. And there was a whole season of episodes where it recounts a lot of these Greek mythologies. I don't know if it had the Minotaur. It did have Icarus. And then it had when King Minos tracks Daedalus to some other place and looks for him.
His name is totally not Daedalus, but I wish it were.
Anyway, Jim Henson captured with his Muppets several of the stories involving that character, quite well actually, but totally child appropriate. Well, in my mind, child appropriate, which is impressive again now that I know the original stories of these Greek things. So I would recommend that. But I love anything Jim Henson.
All right. Well, we'll end on that note because we're past the hour mark. So I'm going to detener la transmisión because I'm going to Seville today. So I'll tell you about this later. But yes, let's end on recommending Jim Henson's retelling of Greek mythology, which I, for one, am going to check out ASAP. All right. We're off the air.